Remember I was asking you about volunteers and
yes,
the profile?
Okay, right. Yeah.
Something just fell out of your pocket.
Oh. All right, so yes, I will dive in here, and obviously we have a small group here, which I kind of expected. And I am going to be a developer here. I'm going to throw development stuff at you, but feel free to stop me and ask lots of questions. So Civi and customization. Civi is built to be customized. I kind of mentioned this yesterday, but we'll say it again. I think that more than a lot of Joomla extensions, it's architectured in such a way that it begs to be customized. And that's highly intentional because there's this inevitability with our audience. When you're working with not-for-profits, they all have their own way of wanting to do things. They range so widely in the services they provide and the business processes that they embrace. And it's impossible on one hand to have a one-size-fits-all. And it's also impossible to try to throw everything into configuration options in the system. As it is, when you get going with Civi, there's a ton of things that you need to configure, depending on how many of the tools you're using. But it would just be complete overkill if they tried to even put more in there. So there's always this debate amongst the core developers. Okay, well, how do we organize our configuration, streamline it? What do we put in there? What do we not put in there? But anyway, all of this leads to the fact that the core team, to their credit, has really said we want this to be something that developers can get in there and can do some customization of pretty easily. So let's talk about the goals for what we're going to do today. I want you to leave, if you're using Civi right now, I want you to feel empowered to do more customization of it. If you're not using Civi and you're just kind of sticking your toes in the water, then at the very least, I'd like you to leave seeing what is possible with customization fairly easily, and what you can do to extend it to whatever clients you have or your organization. So we're going to do some code review architecture. That'll be pretty quick. Just kind of talk about the code models that they use. Talk about the different ways that you can customize Civi. Talk a little bit about best practices, and then I'm going to walk through a bunch of different examples that I've kind of done in advance so that we can see what goes on here. All right. Again, stop me if you want to. All right. So Civi does not use MVC architecture. So that's the first thing to just get out there and embrace. And it does use a DAO-BAO model, which is just a different way of doing things. I actually like it better than MVC personally, but maybe that's because I've been using Civi so much. I'm mostly working in Civi code even more than Joomla code. But let's talk about what it does. So this up here, which you can see the arrow behind it, is sort of the process flow. So you've got your database, it's got your data. You got DAO, which is your data access objects. And the purpose of the DAO is to interpret your tables. All right, so all it does is it just defines very simple layer, and it doesn't really do much. You're not going to go in there and modify it at all. But what it does is it says things like, okay, well, here are all the fields defined in my table, and here are some attributes about it that are not actually included in my table. So some of those attributes just have to do with Civi, like, is this field in a default export or a default import? So things like that. What are some of the foreign key definitions between different tables and stuff like that? Which, some of it does get into the actual MySQL tables. But just think of it as defining my tables in my database. Now, I've stuck in here pair, which maybe should be here or maybe over here. But the idea is that there's a lot of Civi that's based upon the pair libraries, most significantly quick form. So all of the forms if you're familiar with pair, it's just a library that, a PHP library that has all kinds of different functions and stuff like that. So Civi does use the pair for all its data handling and a lot of other things as well. At some point in a future version, they're going to move away from pair because it's kind of old, kind of kludgy. It's very powerful. It's got a lot of real benefit, but there's other frameworks out there that are more powerful that they will eventually go to. But for now, it's there. You might want to familiarize yourself with it. The next layer is BAO, which is business access objects. That's your methods that actually do things. Okay, that's like saying create a contribution, or create a contact, or build a current employer for a contact, or create a relationship, or delete a contact, trash a contact, something like that. So all of those things, this is the heart of what you are likely working with if you need to get into the core functions. All right, so that's kind of roughly equivalent to the model layer in MVC. So that's where you'll spend time. And you're rarely going to come over here to DAO and pair, because the BAO layer, that's really what is taking all that data and deciding what you're going to do with it in very well defined, meaningful, named functions. Civi uses a templating layer. So this is roughly equivalent to the view in an MVC structure. They use the Smarty templating language right now, which I was like, well, why do we even have Smarty? Why don't we just do what Joomla uses and just write everything in PHP? I think that there's some value in Smarty, because when you look at a Smarty file, most of it's just HTML. And it then has bracketed variables that are being passed from the code into that layer. So visually, like, you know how you get into like a view for Joomla, and I don't know about you, but like I get so sick of seeing open, close PHP tags. It's just annoying to me. I don't know why. Maybe it's just me. But it just, when I read through it, I have a hard time sometimes distinguishing between the HTML and the variables that are being passed and the objects that are being looped through, or whatever it might be. I think that the Smarty layer does a better job of that. So anyway, that's just commentary. It uses Smarty, so you'll want to be familiar with it. And we'll get into
Smarty. Make it cross-platform?
Cross-platform meaning
in Joomla?
Yes. Everything that we're going to do today, except for the Joomla plugins that I'll look at, is cross-platform. So Joomla, Drupal, WordPress, if you dabble in other CMSs, everything today will be cross-platform except for the Joomla plugin, although the Joomla plugin is roughly equivalent to a Drupal module. So, I mean, there's a lot of continuity there. All right, so Smarty. Civi does ship with jQuery, and so that's, you'll see a lot of the Smarty templates have jQuery that's being referenced there, and then sometimes it's an include file to handle some of the functions we use. And then it makes it out to the web, it gets rendered, and the user thing is just to say that, well, I've obviously got data coming this way, and I've got user interaction through the side. Let's talk about the directory structure, okay? Because Civi is big, it's got a lot of files. I'm going to show you the directory structure in the next slide, but let me just point out what I view as the most important main folders in the CiviCRM package, because again, it's not using MVC. So you're going to have a folder called CRM that's got all your PHP files. That is all the work. That is everything that is going to be running the software for the most part. You've got a templates folder, which, surprise, surprise, has all of your Smarty templates in it. You've got a packages folder, which includes all the libraries that Civi ships with. So if you've got to reference an external library, if you want to throw another jQuery plugin in or something like that, you could do it there. Extern, there's some externally triggered files. This is like IP and pingbacks if you're using payment processors, and I don't know if you're familiar with how that works, but typically you run a transaction that communicates with PayPal, and then PayPal will communicate back to the system, and it does it through these externally referenced files. There's a CSS folder, and there is a Joomla folder, and that just has some of that actually has some MVC in it, just enough so that it works in Joomla, basically. So it's got, it does have folders for the different menu items, the view folders that are required for that. So that's something that you might reference. There's also some helper files that allows Joomla and Joomla to interact with the CiviCRM API really easily. All right, so then within the CRM folder, which again is the heart and soul of what you would want to potentially become familiar with, you're going to have subfolders, and this is a common structure here for the subfolders, and they reference that architecture we saw earlier. So you're going to have a DAO folder, which has the data access objects, and each one is going to be named after the table. So you'll see something that says contacts, you'll see something that says activities, because it correlates to the table and defines those things. The BAO, which has all your methods that actually do work. Forms, that's just the code that is actually interacting with the form, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. Pages, so Civi distinguishes between forms and pages, and this is because of pair mostly. A form collects data, a page just renders data. That's the only difference. Now, obviously, a form also renders, but the difference is that there's a different workflow Forms have a post process that takes whatever you collected and does something with it, whereas pages don't. They just have a simple rendering. Then there's some other folders that you might see, not always. Controllers, selectors, this happens with you have like multi-step forms, and selectors are for like lists of records. If you've got to search XML files, there's some ways that we use that. So again, I'm just trying to give you an introduction to how it's structured and where you'll find things. So here's an example. Just took a snapshot of this, and this is activity. So if you go into, you know what, if you've got a laptop and you feel like doing this, I mean, it might be helpful if you download a package from CiviCRM.org and open it and look at it. So that's, you don't have to, but you know, if you want to, that's helpful. So we've got this CRM folder, and it's organized by the different subcomponents or the different feature areas of Civi. So there is one here called activity, because we have activities in CiviCRM. That's communication records that you attach to the contact. So within that main block of feature, we've got subfolders like BAO and controller, DAO, form, import, page, selector, state machine, all of these different folders. And this is a common structure. So let's say, this is why this is valuable, okay? There's a lot of consistency in the Civi code. As much as there's a lot of code, there's also a lot of consistency. So if you're sitting here and you're saying, I'm going to do some customization, I need to change how the event flow works, when people register for an event. I need to change something in there. Well, you're going to go to CRM, that's where most of the work is. You're going to find your event folder, and you're going to decide, well, am I changing the flow of a form, in which case I come down to the form folder, or maybe the form is referencing a BAO method that says register contact. And so I might need to get into there. Okay? And then within there, I'm going to find some other files, because obviously when you're handling events, you've got a lot of different things that happen with events. You've got managing events. You have registering people for events. You've got showing participant listings, searching events, importing event records. So there's a lot of things that happen with events. They're all contained under the events folder, and there's going to be different BAO and different form files for each of those. But in activities, we can see this because there is, for example, let's go to the DAO first. So this is interacting with the tables. There are 3 tables in the database that interact with activities. One that says activity actually stores the activity record. Activities can be assigned to contacts, and activities have a target. So the target is who the activity is, who the contact or contacts the activity is with. John and Jane Doe call up on the phone and say they want to become a donor. All right? Well, that's 2 contacts. So this one activity can be attached to both of those contacts, which is why we have a separate table with our highly normalized database in order to reference that. One activity attached to 2 contacts. I have an activity target table. So these are just defining those 3 tables. I've got the same 3 up here for BAO. So anytime I'm interacting with the activity, I'm probably using a function, a method in here. And if I'm assigning an activity to someone, if I'm designating someone as the target for an activity, then I'm probably using some BAO functions up here. There's a 4th one for query, because you can search activities. And so we need to have some definitions and methods to handle that. Down here under forms, similarly, I've got an activity form, activity filter, links, I'm viewing activities, I'm searching activities. Tasks, and this task folder is because whenever I do a search throughout Civi, anytime I do a search, I can take action on the search results. So for contacts, I might do a search and then export the records, or add them to a group, or send them an email. For activities, I might do a search and assign them to a contact, or delete them, or export them. Okay? So all these tasks are also linked under a folder here. I know this is kind of overwhelming if you're not familiar with the system, but I guess what I'm trying to just hopefully present is the basic structure, so that when you get in there, you have some clues as to where to find the files you might be looking for. Import, that's because you can import to activities. Not all components and features have that, so that's unique to this page. Occasionally you'll find an AJAX file, because there are more and more AJAX types of activities within Civi that get functions. Stop me if I'm going too fast. Stop me if you've got questions. We've got a small group here. I'd rather be interactive and help you out. All right, so the other thing that's really helpful about Civi is that my classes, this is pretty common throughout programming in general, but my classes are going to correlate to my files, and those are going to correlate to my Smarty files. So here I've got a file called event, form, registration, register, and that's actually the file that is used when I want to register an individual for an event. Pretty intuitive.
And that's cross-platform.
That's cross-platform. Okay. Registration, register. That is registering someone for an event. Now, the class is, surprise, surprise, just broken up with underscores. And the template, the Smarty template that renders that page is under templates and then the same path. Okay? So a lot of consistency there. One thing, I got a slide about this actually a little bit later, but I'll mention it now. So since there's a lot of files and you're often like, I'm on this page and Civi, I need to change something on it. Where do I find the frickin' thing? So that can be very frustrating. One tip that you can do is go to the source for the page. Go to the page in your browser, view the source, and do a search for .tpl. Because the template that is used to render that page, there's always a comment that indicates what that template is. So you could go there, if you went to a registration page right now and went to the source, you'd find register.tpl commented on that page. And from there, you now know that this is the form file that was impacting that page. So you can work backwards from the page, the template page, and figure out what class, what file is impacted by that. So a little trick of the trade here. All right, so let's talk about forms for a minute, because I think forms are where most people are doing work, changing how workflows happen, things like that. And there is a standard form flow that is just helpful to know. This is not unique to Civi. This is all kind of embraced from Pair. So if you're familiar with Pair's quick form and how that works, then this should be pretty familiar. Basically, when I go to a form, I'm registered. We'll stick with our registering someone for an event. I've got typically in a standard flow 5 things that happen. Pre-process. That happens as soon as I click the link and I go and I trigger that form PHP file, and it's rendered in Smarty. And what that does is it says, well, is there anything I need to do or be aware of before I render the page? So the biggest thing that does is it might get some funky, it might like check permissioning. So if the person is not allowed to view that, it might make sure that any prerequisites for that are met. Like if there's a dependency, a certain form is dependent upon some other record in existence, then it will go and check that. So anything like that needs to happen and be checked, be confirmed before I even load the page, that happens in pre-process. Then we have set default values, which goes and retrieves data from the database if the record already exists. If you're creating a new record, a new contact, a new registration, then it sets any default values that you've configured. And for most fields in the system, especially custom fields in the system, you can define a default value for it. So that's going to go and check and see if there's any default values from an existing record or configured in the system, and then set those. And then you have build quick form, which does all the work of actually rendering, determining what fields are present, option lists, any kind of dependency that they have. It goes back and it looks at any kind of configuration options and decides what needs to be displayed based upon the configuration options. That event registration, okay, when you configure an event in the system, there's like 8 tabs of configuration that you can choose. Well, all of that is retrieved, and then build quick form has the logic to decide what gets displayed, what doesn't get displayed based upon those options. All right. So at this point, the page is rendered, the form is rendered in the browser, and I can look at those form fields, I can fill it out. And then when I submit it, I always forget the name of this. Civi has the form flow model where you render the page and then you resubmit it. What's that called? I forget, it's got a catchy phrase. So what happens is that form gets resubmitted, goes through this, and then it hits the form rule. And that's where all of your form validation happens. Are there required fields? Are there certain fields that are not just required for data, but have certain data types. This has to be an integer. This needs to be a string value. You need to choose an option from the list. Anything like that, that's going to happen in your form rules. Okay? And then, provided you successfully completed the form, it goes down to post-process, which is where any data handling is triggered. So post-process is probably going to go back to those BAO functions, and do things like say, save the registration, send an email to the registrant, send an email to whoever BCC'd, the staff, mark the contribution, or process the contribution if there's a payment that's associated with the event registration, send a notification back to the system to do whatever. So anything that happens, that's where the data actually gets processed in that post-process. Okay?
If any of this gets rendered, where does the template get called?
Build form, build quick form.
Okay.
Yep. So, so the fields are defined there, and then they're passed as variables to Smarty, and Smarty renders them with HTML. Okay, so before I go on, that's a quick overview, but that was all I was going to do in terms of understanding architecture, file system, and stuff like that. Everyone cool with that, or do you want to talk about it more, specific questions? All right, so we're going to go into, I'm sorry, did you have oh, thumbs up. So we're going to go into customization methods, and we'll see some of this in action, so, hopefully you'll see some of it be clearer. All right, so customization. We love to customize Civi. It's great. And I really mean that. It's not sarcastic, because I enjoy seeing what some of my clients make me do, because it can get very creative. And if we got time, I have a case study I can share that is a client that did some really unusual stuff with Civi that I kind of enjoyed working with. Except when the deadlines were looming. That's when it was not fun. Okay, so there's a number of different ways that we can customize Civi. And we'll go through these in order. So the first way is through PHP overrides. So PHP override simply says, I take a file that is in core, and I copy it into an override directory. I'll explain that in a minute. And Civi uses my version instead of the core version. Okay? So I use this override, I can get in there, I can hack it, I can do all kinds of fun stuff to it, and what I have not done is touch the core files. I've moved it out. Now if you're familiar with Joomla and the view layer, you might be familiar with how you can take any view in a component or module, and you can put it into your template in an HTML directory, and you can override that view. The difference is that in Civi, you're not limited to the views. You can override any file. With a couple exceptions, there's one caveat. There are some files that are like core files that basically instantiate CiviCRM, bootstrap it. It happens very early on in the process of Civi, when you get into Civi or you use a Civi page, Civi being used. A handful of files that, because they happen before the override functionality kicks in, they cannot be overridden. So there are a few files, but it's very rare that you need to even use them or modify them. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. But if you do have, if it happens, just be aware that there are a couple. And I don't have a list off the top of my head, but anyway, so PHP overrides. And then there's Smarty overrides, which is the exact same idea, except you're overriding your Smarty templates. All right? And I'll show you, let me show you right now. So in, can you see this all right? I can zoom in. Let's see. All right. So in administrator, the menu item administrator system settings, there's an option called directories. And we've got a place here where we can have custom templates, custom PHP path directory, and the CiviCRM extensions directory. Okay, and we're going to use that too. So these three folder locations are empty by default when you install Civi. The custom templates, custom PHP, those are your override directories. And all you're doing is you're just defining where in your file system you're going to stick these overrides. So I always put them in a common place because I got a lot of clients and I want to, not drive myself too crazy. And Civi already puts a lot of stuff in the media CiviCRM folder, so that's where I always put it. But you don't have to put it there. So I do it in custom TPL, custom PHP, and custom EXT. Makes sense to me. but you can do whatever you want. The extensions directory we're going to talk about a little bit later. Just worth noting that this is where you would define that location. Okay, so let's zoom out. Oops. And come back to my presentation.
Do you recommend it in media?
I do. Only because that's where the CiviCRM cache files are, that's where the log files are, that's where any file uploads that you put are by default. So there's just a lot of CiviCRM stuff there. It makes sense to me that we just put the TPL and PHP overrides there as well. Okay, so PHP overrides, Smarty overrides. There's one really cool addendum to the Smarty overrides, and that is what's called an extra file. So you'd have a file name .extra.tpl, and what this does is it appends whatever you put in that file to the corresponding Smarty file. So if I've got register.tpl, and I go in and I create register.extra.tpl, rather than overriding register.tpl, I'm appending whatever content I put in here to that template. And I'll show you why that's really cool a little bit later, but just hold that thought. Let me just run through these, and we'll get into each of these in a little bit more detail, so let me run through them. So you can customize Civi with a Joomla plugin, all right, and we're going to do one of those today. And then Civi has kind of a relatively new feature that is its own extension framework. So you can extend CiviCRM with CiviCRM extensions that are CMS agnostic. They're not specific to WordPress, Drupal, or Joomla. And that's kind of cool. If you've got something that has a broader appeal that would be valuable to people regardless of what CMS they're using, it doesn't have any interaction with the CMS itself, or if it does, it can do it through the BAO layers, then that's that's kind of a recommended direction to go in.
Is that an example of what that Civi school would be?
Yes. Well, so Civi School was originally done in a Drupal module, and I don't know if the developer who did it has moved it to Civi extensions, but it should be.
Okay.
It definitely should be, because it
Okay.
would have broad appeal. So Civi extensions right now can be reports, custom searches, payment gateways, or what they call modules. I'm lobbying to have this named a Civi extension or something like that, because modules mean something specific in the Joomla world, and it means something specific in the Drupal world. So I don't like that term because it can be confusing. But it is just a generic extension. You can use it to do just about anything. You can basically throw a bunch of customizations in, stick it in this module, and run with it. And we'll do one of those later. Got a lot of good stuff. So all of those wonderful things there are so we don't hack core. We don't want to hack core because kittens die when you hack core. Is that a great picture? Just gotta appreciate the picture. I mean,
Do you think there's actually chiefs in that?
so unless you have no other choice, I mean, obviously there's times when you just can't get around it. You gotta alter a library or I don't know something, and you just can't get away with it. Just make sure you document it, because we all want our upgrades to be as flawless and seamless and painless as possible. But the point is that all of those different customizations methods are so that you have a lot of options and a lot of ways to control things without having to touch the core files. All right. So before we go on, let me just talk about a few debugging tips, and then we'll get into the specifics of each of those customization methods. All right. So some debugging tips, and I think they're gonna take these slides. I did these slides as a reference, so I'll make sure that the people who ran the conference get it. And there's a ton of links that I put later on so that you can reference things. But so don't feel like you have to write it all down. All right, so Civi has a bunch of ways that you can just make your life easier with debugging. There's a CRM core error class, which doesn't just spit out errors, but it also allows for some debugging tools. So there's a debug method, a debug var, and a debug log message. They're all very similar. The debug will log to screen, debug var will log to file, and debug log message will log to file if set to true, or to screen if set to true, or to file if set to false in the second parameter. And those are just nice because they basically are the equivalent of wrapping a print R in pre-tags. so that when you see your arrays and your objects, they're using Courier and they're structurally presented. So that's just a really nice feature to be able to do that. And then there's another one, query or backtrace, which you can throw anywhere and it will just spit out a backtrace at that point. So if you want to see, well, what are all the different files that were hit at this point in the code, you can do that. Now, Civi has its own log file. And it's located in Media CiviCRM, config and log, and then it's got a really long, ugly file name .log. And it will just continue to keep logs. It doesn't throw the logs away. Some of the log files will just track activities that took place. For example, if you use recurring contributions, one of the things that happens is PayPal or Authorize.net will ping back to your site and will insert a contribution record when that next recurring payment takes place. Well, as a helpful little, making sure things are working right, there's the log file is hit whenever that happens. Anytime you have crons, there's a number of different jobs that can happen inside of Civi, cron jobs that can happen, and those all get logged so you have a timestamp of when they happen. So it's not just for errors, it's for other things as well. And using debug var, I can log in my code to this. That's really, really useful if you have to debug a production site. So if you don't have a development site that you can be using, so that way you can just spit out variables to your log file. I usually, when I'm doing heavy development, I'm tailing it in my command line, so I can just see it spit out as I go through things. It's also helpful if you need to capture logs when you're doing a form process where, like post-process, for example, when you submit a form, post-process is hit. Well, what that does is it takes care of all this data and then it redirects you to another page. It doesn't stop on post-process. So if you're debugging some, a form saving data, if you send it to file, you can see what's happening over the course of that. And you could always throw debug and exit, but that's kind of nice too. So yeah, that's really useful. And now those files don't go away. What Civi does is it just says once it reaches a certain size limit, then it starts a new file, and every month it starts a new file. So it does break it up. You don't have enormously large files. More debugging tips. There is an option in Administer CiviCRM system settings for enabling debugging. Okay? And when you do that, if you do hit a fatal error, it'll spit out a backtrace for you. And you can also display your Smarty variables, which is the next point here. All right, so when I get to my page, I'm on my event registration page, and I want to move things around, or I want to decide what chunks of content are displayed in certain ways. One of the options I have available is to allow the browser to tell me what variables are being passed to Smarty and being rendered in my template. And we do that by just appending and Smarty debug equals 1 to my URL. Real simple. You have to have debugging turned on in order to do that. So that's administer system settings, debug. And so turn it on, and then when you do that, it'll spit that out. It does it in a little pop-up window, so you can keep it on the side, and it gives you all the different arrays and objects that are produced by Smarty. I mentioned this before. You can search your source for a page, look for .tpl, and then trace what file was impacted. Another option here is to log queries to file. So if you're having a problem with like a search, and you say, well, why isn't this record showing up in the search results? Or I need to change, I want to add some fields to my search form, and I need to figure out what queries are going on, or something along those lines. Well, if you go to your settings file, so Civi has its own settings file, which is in Administrator Components, CiviCRM. It's just the standard Joomla components, Administrator Components folder. There's a settings file, and there's a bunch of constants defined there. And if you define the constant CiviCRM DAO debug, then it will spit out any queries to that log file. Super helpful if you've got query problems and you're really, why isn't this showing up the way I think it should? You can also log your mail to file. So let's say you're doing some development in CiviMail, which is the mass email tool in Civi, and you don't really want to send a bunch of emails to people. Okay? You can actually log the emails to a file and define this constant and where you want it logged. Okay. So a lot of cool tools here to help with debugging. All right, so talked about the different options available. some debugging tips. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of those options, the PHP, the TPL overrides, the plugin, the Joomla plugin, and then the CiviCRM extension. I'm going to go through each of those, and we're going to do some stuff, okay? So I got a demo site set up. I already did some work. Hey, that'd be great, yeah. Good man. You saw this red line. So we're going to run through these, and I've got some cool stuff set up, and so we'll see this in action. Okay, so I already mentioned how we define the location. We saw that. The way that the PHP and the TPL overrides work is that I need to follow the pattern for core files. So I define where my starting point is. But then when I want to override it, I just follow the folder structure here in order to do that. And I'll show you that example. What are the pros and cons of using the overrides? The pro is that I really have complete control over things, and I don't have to hack core. I can get into my BAO functions, even my DAO functions. I can get at anything, and I can change the way Civi functions. Okay, and so I've got control over the flow, if it's a Smarty template, the layout of the page, and I don't have to hack core. Now the con is that I do have to maintain that file through upgrades. So let's say right now, the current version of Civi is 4.2.1. Let's say I've got a 4.1 site, and I need to go through my upgrade process. The upgrade's fairly simple. I just reinstall Civi. I'm given a link where I upgrade the database, and it kind of just does it for me. But I had 6 files in my PHP overrides in 4.1 that I was using. So what I need to do is I need to basically take those files and I need to re-implement my modifications in the 4.2 version of that file. Because there's other stuff that might have been added. You know, Civi added a new function for events that is not in my 4.1 file. I need to get it updated to that. I just use WinMerge, which is the diffing software on Windows, you know, or you can use Linux diff or whatever. And so I just diff my files, and anything that is not my customization, I just make sure I have it updated in my override file. So, you know, if you've got a handful of overrides, it's really not a big deal. But it is a con because you do have to maintain that through versions. Comment, save yourself some time, make sure you comment. So anytime that I am modifying an override, I'm putting //LCD. That's my that's my company, Advanced Consulting Design. So I throw that in there so that I can do a search and I can easily find every single place that I modified this override. And it just makes it a whole lot easier when I need to upgrade it. But do be aware of that. All right, so we're going to do an example here. And one common area that a lot of my clients want customizations are with reports. So Civi has a reporting framework. It basically works by having all these report templates that are defined by the system. And the report template does, it defines what that report is going to do, what options are available to it. So it defines what fields can be presented, what filters can be applied, what sort orders are available to it. Sometimes there's like a crosstab type query that's taking place where I'm doing some kind of statistical calculations on the data, summing, counting, things like that. So the report template defines that, and then the report instances are where the user gets in there, chooses what settings they want, and can save that and have a whole bunch of different saved reports based upon the template. But I often have situations where the client says, can you remove this field? I never use it. It's cluttering the interface. Can you add this field? I want to be able to do this in a report. And so, so we'll do one of those, okay? So most, the reports were built in such a way that they tend to be a little bit top-heavy. There's, Civi does a lot of class inheritance. So you'll have like this base class, and then you'll have a report that extends that base class. So a report file, each template is really just a single file. So it tends to be kind of long. There's a lot of stuff that's defined in it, but it does borrow from that inherited class, that parent class. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into the current employer report, which out of the box gives you a list of current employers for contacts. As the name would suggest, it's a pretty simple report. And I got a client that, fictitious client, that only works in the United States. So they don't really need the country field. That's a waste of space for them. Let's get rid of it. And the employer is a relationship type, employer-employee relationship. And this report by default only gives the start date for relationships. Now, relationships don't have to have a start and end date. That's optional, but they can. And so by default, it only has a start. They want the end date as well. Okay? And actually, I don't think I did this. Add relationship enabled, disabled. Yeah, so we'll skip that. I only did the top two. All right, so let me go in here and okay, go back here. And let me first come up here, and I'm going to go to this report just so you see it before I've altered it. All right, so here is the current employer report. If I open up my report criteria, you'll see I've got a country field, and I only have employee since, which is the relationship start date. And coming down here, I've got employee since as a filter, but I don't have the end date as a filter. All right, and let me just scroll down here. There's not much more to see. I ran this report, and I don't have a lot of data in this demo site, but I do have 3 records with employers. So I've got Lighthouse Consulting Design, hey, I'm employed by them, and Worldwide United for Food, which is a fictitious organization, and there's 2 employees there, Judy and John. All right, so that's great. Now, you'll notice that Judy does have a start date. Okay? So let me go into my IDE, and let's see the structure. All right, so I've already done all the work here, but we'll see how this works. Okay, so here's a Joomla implementation. So we just, you see the standard Joomla folders that you're probably familiar with. Come down here to my media folder, CiviCRM, and I've got, here, let me close custom extension, we're not using that right now. But I've got custom PHP. Now what I did was I just changed the folder name. I just wanted to disable what I had done. I'm going to change that folder name so that my override directory kicks in. But you'll see here that I've come down, and this is the folder I defined in the interface, and then I simply follow the folder structure for where the core file is located. So CRM, report, form, contact, and then currentemployer.php. Can you all see that? Zoom that in. All right, pretty straightforward there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to rename this and get rid of my leading X. Fantastic. That will immediately let the interface configuration, that folder, is now kicked in. It is now in place. All right. And let me just open up this file. You can see what I did. So one of the things that a report does is in the construction. This is the initial construction of it. Oh yeah, here, function construct. It should be kicked down a line. Anyway, there's this really long array. It's kind of obnoxious. Yes.
Where did you get this structure from originally?
So I just went into the core files, which I could come up here in Administrator, Components, CiviCRM, and there is a subfolder here called CiviCRM, and then that's the one that has it. So
you copied it from there?
Yep.
Okay.
So I left it there because I don't want to touch my core files. Leave them where they are. Found that file. I knew what file I had to modify, so I found that file. I copied it into my override directory, and I maintain the directory structure. So I can come down here and see report contact or report form contact.
I'm sorry, did you have to point it to that file that you were overriding, or because it's in there, it's automatically overridden?
Well, remember that I went to the administrator. I was in the interface,
okay.
and I defined the base for my override directory.
Okay. So anything that's in there is automatically?
Yes.
Okay.
As long as I maintain the folder structure. So I have to maintain that folder structure. It looks a little goofy because I've got, all this hierarchy for the sake of one file,
right.
But it works. I mean, it makes sense. I'm just maintaining that. And honestly, it's helpful because you know where it came from. You just got to make sure you get that folder structure right. So yeah, I copied it here, and then I opened it up and I modified it. And if you see over here, I know it might be a little bit small, but there's this really long array called columns. Okay, so that this object has an underscore columns array. And what this does is it defines the tables, the fields, the filters, the order that are going to be part of this report. So if I come down here to here, okay. So I've got a table here called CiviCRM relationship. I know you might not be able to see it, so I'll just read it out. CiviCRM relationship. And there's a first element in the array. It's a second element, but it's the first level, is for fields. And that's going to define what checkboxes are on that top section of my report. What fields am I allowed to display in this report? So I had start date. I added end date. And of course, I commented it so I could find it easily. And then I came down here to filters, which is also a first level array element. And I added end date down here. So this one determines whether it's visible. Is that an option to be displayed? And this one down here says, can I filter on it? Now, I did this in a couple minutes. You know, you'll learn from examples. It's really easy to come up here and say, oh, well, here's my start date. I'm just going to copy it, okay, and change it to end date. You have to know what the field name is, but that's easy enough to find out. Change the text, the title of it. It's going to be employee until. And then I came down here and did the same thing. I just copied this filter down here and named it end date and changed the settings for it. All right, and then the other thing that I wanted to do is, if I come down a little bit further, I have my CiviCRM address table. And I came down here to where country was in the fields, and I just commented it out. And I came down to where the country was in the filters, and I commented that out. I don't want that field. Make it go away. So just a handful of really small, simple modifications here. So let me come back to my current employer report. I'm just going to reload it. And if I open up my criteria, I now no longer have the country, and I do have employee until. And then if I scroll down a little bit farther, you can see, hopefully right here, employee until. And so I've got my date ranges for that. So now if I just enabled that, so I'll preview this report again. That new option selected. And now Judy, oh, she has an employee since and an employee until, because her name is Judy Retirement, and she's going to retire in a couple weeks. Okay, so that's a PHP override. Existing file, I dumped it into my PHP override folder, I modified it, made sure I commented it sufficiently, and poof, it's there.
So I have a non-technical question.
Yes?
How would you go about considering if that might be something somebody would be, interested in and suggesting it back to the core?
Yeah, so that's a great question. The forums and IRC channel are where the developers hang out. And so, if I had a question like that, I'd go onto the IRC channel. And, if you're there for a little while, you get to know people. You just do, the two lead developers are Don Lobo and Dave Greenberg. D Lobo and D Greenberg, or DGG on the IRC channels. And, and I know them pretty well, so I just ask them, I say, hey, I think this would be about, and I kind of know at this point what would be and would not be. I think that end date should be part of this report, so that probably should be submitted by. Now country, that should also remain in part, so that's not a customization that I would submit to core. But it's a judgment call, and the worst thing that can happen is that you propose it and they say no, or nothing happens with it. There's also a bug tracker. It's called Jira, which you can get to from the CiviCRM website, and I have a link, I think, later on. And so you could always just submit your patch there. Okay, and if they say, they review everything that comes through there, so they'll say, all right, great, we'll apply it. Or they may take it and they may do some refactoring to make sure it's up to the standards, the code standards, and stuff like that. How just the code is written. They may say, we just don't think that this should be a customization. But they strongly encourage you to submit back to core. Yeah, I have hundreds of patches that, all the time. You fix bugs, you add a capability. All right, isn't this customization stuff fun? You're a nerd about that. All right, Smarty override example. Let's move on. Any page rendered by Civi pushed through the Smarty templating engine. We talked about this. That's HTML, and also some variables that are passed in order to be rendered in the HTML. There's some cool things that can go on with events and profiles with Smarty, and that is that you can ID specific subfolders. So why is this important? Well, because if you've got a conference and you've gotten a registration form for a conference and you want to modify the layout of that form, you probably don't want that layout to necessarily impact the luncheon seminar you're doing next week. Okay, like it's not uncommon that you are going to have events and profiles, which are just forms that are being submitted through the site. It's not uncommon that you're going to have some desire to have some customization specific to that one event, that one profile. So what you can do here is you just you trace your folder structure identically to how we did in PHP, the override for PHP. We did the same thing in our template override. And but then right before I put my file name, I create another folder with the ID number. So this would only impact event ID 1. That override would only impact that one event.
That ID number is the number on that Smarty form?
It's the event ID.
Okay.
So you can go into the system and you can see that if you go to the Manage Events page, you'll see the ID number for it.
Okay.
We do profiles and events, which is really cool. Okay, so let me go ahead and we'll do this. I've got down here my Smarty TPL, and what did I do here? I forgot what I did. Okay. Let me go to the front of my site here, and I've got some sample pages. Like that. Hold on, let me just check which is event 1. All right, so event 1 is my monthly luncheon seminar. So let me go to that. All right, so I've got this monthly luncheon seminar. Oh, it's already. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. Okay. Yeah, here's what I want to do. Okay. So profiles, I'm not sure how familiar people are with Civi, but profiles are collections of fields that you implement in forms. And so I've got a profile that's in the top position, and I've got one that's in the bottom position. So name and address is in the top position, meal options is in the bottom position, and in between I have my payment section. I don't like that. That doesn't make sense to me. I want this, in fact, I want all my fields to be above the payment option. I want payment options to be the very last thing on this page. All right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over to my template, and this little block that says include form block custom post, which is just the include for those profiles that are in the after position, that was down here. Maybe it was a little bit lower. It was, I think it was like right, I don't know. It was somewhere down here. It was lower. It was below the billing block elements. And so what I did was I just grabbed it, just copied it. I pasted it up here and I gave my comment, because I comment everything. And that's it. I just wanted to move that. So now I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, where I come over here and I'm just going to rename my folder because I wanted you to be able to see the before and after. And now I'll reload the form. And my meal options are above it. But it only affects this form. If I've got a bunch of different events that are registered, created in my site, then they would still have this in its original location.
So you created a subdirectory for this event, this form.
Yep, let me go back so you can see that. So it's down here.
In your media.
Yes. So media, custom TPL, followed the pattern, and then I added the 1 for that event ID and put my register.tpl file there. Yes?
Where do you get the event ID? Is that's in
So
Joomla?
that is, I'll go back. If I come over to my manage events, monthly luncheon seminar ID 1. All right. Now, I don't have to put it in that one subfolder. If I had just put this file in registration, then it would have impacted all. Right. Now, the other thing that I could do is that I could have, this might be you know, a modification that you want consistently for all events. So I could put that up here. But then let's say I had something else that I wanted implemented for ID1. I could still put something in here. It will always, like there's an order of preference, so it will look for the ID specific version and use that if it exists. If it doesn't, it looks for one in the next folder up and use it if it exists. And if it doesn't, it uses core. All right? Okay, we'll do one more of these because I want to talk about the extra file. So now the again, the good thing about that template, that Smarty file override, is that I have complete control over my layout. The bad thing is I have to maintain it. I do have to make sure that if there are changes and upgrades, I come back and update it. So instead of overriding Smarty files, you could create a new file named whatever the file name is. You have to be in the same folder, same file name, .extra.tpl. And the benefit is that you don't have to, you can then inject some stuff into that form without having to modify and maintain the entire TPL file. Okay? You only interact with the elements you're modifying. Now, it does rely on some JavaScript to do that, typically. Okay? Because I've just got this file that's being appended to the bottom of my Smarty file. So in order to actually have it implemented in my page, in the DOM, I need to use some jQuery in order to kind of inject it there. But that's the cool thing about jQuery, is that you can do some cool stuff like that. So the one limitation is that there are some files that don't get picked up by this feature. I believe that whenever Smarty includes another file, because Smarty has the ability to have it includes, then that include file does not get flushed through the extras. And that may get worked out in future versions of Civi, but right now there are some situations where you'll notice that the extra file doesn't get hit. If I have doubts about that, I'm like, why isn't this getting hit? I'll just throw like a JavaScript alert so that it forces something to pop up in my screen when I'm testing. So I did this, and we'll take a look at this. So down here, I've got, I'll zoom in again since it's almost so small. I've got CRM event form registration, and then you'll notice that I've got this register.extra.tpl file. And it doesn't have a whole lot in it. It can be a lot smaller, but not that small. Let's see if I can do this. Okay. All right, so here's what I wanted to do. Let me zoom out, and I'll explain it because it's already kicked in because I changed my folder name. So on this registration, okay, I've got an option down here for using a payment processor or pay by check. It's the pay later feature that you can enable for events, and people don't have to submit a credit card at that point in time. They can just say, I'm promising to pay, and then you have to hound them for the next 3 months to get them to actually do that. But because of the hounding feature, reality, not feature, I want to make sure anyone knows if they choose pay by later, they're making a financial commitment to this registration. This isn't casual. This isn't like, oh yeah, well maybe I'll come and I'll just say I'll pay later. That way I don't have to pay out of pocket. And then if I decide to cancel, 5 hours before the event, oh, it's no big deal. It's not going to cost me anything. So I want people to know that. I want them to know it in very, firm terms. So what I want is that when that's clicked, I want them to have a little message that says you need to make sure that you are aware that you're making a financial obligation here. But I don't want it to happen on this form, the luncheon form. I don't know why, just for the sake of the demo. I only want it to happen on my conference form, which is the second form that I've done. And we'll go back to that over here. All right, so event fees, name and address, payment method down here. Okay. So going back to my template extra file, what I do is I first condition. Let's see this. I'll zoom in. I first condition. It's kind of a All right, so I'm going to condition. There are some Smarty variables I have to work with. So one of them is called event. And I could do my and Smarty debug equals 1 in my browser if I'm not sure what the different variables are. So I found that, and I said, okay, well, if the event equals 2, then do all this stuff. Here's my closing if. So right off the bat, I've got this extra file. The extra file can't be ID specific, in the folder structure. So, so I'm conditioning it there. And that's easy enough to do. So I condition it. If it equals 2, which is my annual conference, then do all this stuff. So what do? I say, well, let me write some HTML. give it a class, unique class name, and this is shrunk, but it should say display equals none. I want to hide this, and I'll explain why in a minute. And then I have this nice note, please note, by indicating you'll pay later, you're making a financial obligation, blah, blah, blah. So I write my HTML, and then I come down and I just do a little bit of JavaScript that says, this is hidden to begin with, because I don't want it to show up at the bottom of my page. So I hide it by default. Then I grab it. So this says, no, I'm sorry. This is an element on the form already. This is the payment processor. Those are those two options there. So I say, grab that radio button with the name payment processor. When it's clicked, find out if it's 0, because 0 is pay later. And if someone clicks it and does pay later, then I want to append to that this block, and I want to display it. So I don't know how well you guys know jQuery, but I've grown to appreciate it over time. I used to hate it. So that's just grabbing it, and it's saying append this chunk of HTML, and it was already hidden, so now I'm going to show it. I'm going to display it. Otherwise, let's remove it, because they could click back and forth between those two options. So if they're doing 0, if they're doing pay later, display it. If not, remove it. And that's it. So come back, and if I click this, I get my note. Just injects that right in the DOM. And if I click here, it hides it. If I click back, it shows it again. Now the cool thing about this is that I haven't had to overwrite a file. I've done it all in this extra file, which means if I upgrade to Civi 4.3, then I don't have to go through and diff the file and make all these changes to it. Now, I still have to probably review those customizations. It's possible that an ID or a class name changed, but for the most part, you have a much lower level of updates that you have to make if you're handling it through that. So my rule of thumb is, as long as I'm not doing anything really crazy with the form, because you don't want to do too much DOM manipulation through jQuery, or else the page renders a little bit slower. You get like the form lays out, and then suddenly things move, and it's like, what's going on? So you don't want to do too much of it, but for simple stuff like this, it's great. I don't need to modify the full file. So that's a really cool feature. All right, any questions?
If you wanted to have people pay when on site, would you configure that this way, or is there a different way to set up a payment method?
I would do pay later. Pay later just means that at the point they register, they're not actually giving me money.
Right.
So I might change my message and say, you must pay on site.
I see.
I could, in this case.
But you couldn't change text in the form. I guess you could if you were really good with JavaScript, but I will send.
Yeah, that's actually configurable. So I could have done something longer here, but I wanted to.
Yeah. Okay.
So that is configurable through the event management.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And actually, there's a second chunk of text that will be displayed on the confirmation and thank you page and sent in the email, where you can put more details, like please send your check to so and so, make it out to whatever. But I wanted it here, and that's not included in this particular form, so I decided to add it. All right. So those are overrides. Let's talk about Joomla plugins. So we use plugins to implement CiviCRM hooks. And CiviCRM hooks are basically what in Joomla we refer to as event triggers. All right, so you know how there's like on dispatch and on after dispatch and on user add and on group add, and there's like a bazillion different events that are in the native Joomla that you can implement in your plugins. CiviCRM calls them hooks. That's that's largely because Civi was first implemented with Drupal, and Drupal calls them hooks. And technically speaking, some of them aren't really event triggered in a sense. So they're, in a way, they're broader in their usage than a pure, event. When I'm zoomed in, so this is, oh no, this is actually, okay. So what we do, so here's a reference that you can access, and it's got the list of hooks, examples for how to implement them, what they do. And I can pull that up, actually. Let me. give you an idea of what. Oh, this is great Microsoft Internet access. That's really slow. All right, well, I'll give it a chance and we'll continue talking. So I went ahead and I created a plugin so we can see this in action. And the cool thing is that it is pretty standard for Joomla. And I did this because I actually have a client that wants me to do this. So I have a client that uses RedShop for their store. And what they wanted was they wanted to be able to pull a person's RedShop purchases into CiviCRM so you can view them there. They're not really going to transfer any data. They're not going to do anything fancy, provide any features. They just want to be able to have some access between the two. So I did this on the event dashboard. Oh, here it is now. Okay. Let me show you this and then I'll explain it in a minute. All right, so these are all the hooks. This is a documentation page and talks to you about, it provides some information about implementing hooks. All right, so there's a lot of hooks, which is cool because you can really just do a ton of stuff with hooks. So there's a bunch of hooks that have to do with forms, like if I want to add elements to a form, or if I want to alter the validation of a form, or I can actually alter the content of a form after it's rendered. And post-process would be when that form is submitted, do I need to do anything different with the form elements? There's database-related hooks. These happen at a very, as you say, high layer in the code. So when an object is being saved, I can do things. Okay, that's pre happens before the object is saved. Post happens after it's saved. Custom is custom fields. Copy is when a field is copied. Then there's some called managed, and then these extensions. These all have to do with the CiviCRM extensions and their life cycle. Are they, is there anything that has to happen when they're installed, or they're uninstalled, or they're upgraded? So those all have to do with those CiviCRM extensions. Permissions, some GUI things. Do I want to, impact the page, or the summary tab, or what tabs are displayed, or the menu system, the dashboards, search tasks, actions. Tons of stuff can be implemented with hooks. Down here, mailing label parameters, tokens. If you're using Civi Mail, the mailing feature, you can insert tokens into your mail. So you can say, Dear Brian, have it personalized. If you want to create your own tokens, like I have a client that wanted to include the history of the person's contributions for the year as a token. So I created this token that goes through the contact, pulls their contributions, organizes in this nice table. They just insert that token in their mailing, and poof, they've got this history of contributions over the course of a year that's automatically inserted in their email or PDF. You can generate that to PDF. So really cool things like that you can do. Some of the queries, when an email is sent, when mailing parameters are sent out. So if you need to, append something on the bottom of every email, or I've got a client that wants every single email that comes through the system to be BCC'd to a separate email account. And so I do that through mail params because I can just do it programmatically. I can make sure it happens there, gets pushed out. Merging, case summary, lots of stuff. So the point is that there's a ton of ability to impact the workflow and form rendering, page rendering, all kinds of stuff through hooks. And we'll see how that works here. So we have in CiviCRM something called a contact dashboard, and that's the one that I'm going to impact by this RedShop integration. So the contact dashboard, if someone is logged in, you can expose this form to them, and what it does is it provides them a little bit of a summary of the different things that they've interacted with in your organization. So I've got John Doe, Mr. John Doe, and I logged him in, and I went to this page, and you can see that he's part of a mailing list, he's made some contributions, hasn't registered for any events yet, he's got a membership. These are all blocks that you can turn on and off in the system. It's a really nice little page. I'd like to see some more things added to it. maybe a little bit more configuration options for it, but it's a great way to very easily provide to that end user a history of their interaction. One note, just with regard to this page, there is a permission in the Joomla ACL that controls whether or not, or which user groups can access this page. And by default, the registered user cannot. It's turned off for the registered user. If you're going to use this, you're going to want to turn that on for the registered user. So if you go to this page and you get a permission error, just go check your permissions. It's called User Contact Dashboard. So what I want to do is I want to say, hey, if John Doe has made any purchases through RedShop, I want to display that here. All right? So what I do is I come down and I create a new plugin called, in my CiviCRM plugins, CiviCRM folder, and I call it Civi RedShop. This is a plugin, so you can call it anything. You don't have to put it in a CiviCRM folder. There's a lot of flexibility there. If I open up my XML file, let me close these other things out first.
That's in the core hierarchy, though, right?
It's in plugins, so I'm in Joomla now.
You're in Joomla. Okay.
Joomla plugins.
Joomla plugins. Great.
So if I was to install this from a zip file, this is where it would land. I just developed it here and used the extension Discover option, which is kind of nice. And so,
sorry, Brian, did you do it as a Joomla plugin because you couldn't do it in the CMS agnostic way because of RedShop?
I could do it in the agnostic way. I don't think that it would be valuable because it is not CMS agnostic. It is, right.
Yeah,
RedShop, its dependency on RedShop is specific to Joomla. So I don't think it, you could do it there, but I don't think that there's any benefit in doing that. And I wanted to be able to demonstrate all the different ways you can customize. So that's part of the reason.
Thanks.
So I've got my XML file, it just says my name, it's a standard plugin XML file. I name the plugin, I tell the file where it's going to be. I don't think I actually need, I think with plugins I don't need both language files. All my clients are English speaking, so I'm not really good in the whole language department in Joomla. And then I've got this plugin file rather, which is where I implement my hooks. Now I'm going to implement 2 hooks for this. The first one is page run. The page run hook is called whenever a page is rendered. It's pretty simple. Okay. There's not a lot that's passed to it. There's this page variable that's passed by reference, and it's actually an object. And it does tell me some important things like the contact ID, which is very important for me. And it tells me what page I'm on. So I want to condition it. Whenever you're doing hooks, you're typically conditioning on different aspects. So I'm going to condition on CRM contact page view user dashboard. That's what that page is called. That's the class name for the page. And I'm going to condition on that. Now I didn't just happen to know that, and I probably could have figured it out. But what I did instead was I threw in my debug statement. Okay, so I'll uncomment that so we can see it when we run the page. So I did a little CRM core error debug page, and so I could see that. Let's see. And let me just walk through my code here. All right, because I'm going to use the API, and I'll talk about the API a little bit more in a minute. So I condition on the page, I include my API file, and then I'm going to do a couple calls, actually just one call to the API. When I'm on this page, CiviCRM is aware of my contact ID, but it's not aware of my user ID. Now I could have gotten the user ID, actually I could have got it from the, let me think about that for a minute. Right, I could have got the user ID because I am working with a logged in user. I could have got it from the Joomla user object. But, and that probably would have been one step, one less step than what I've done here, but that's all right, we'll just go with this. So the page, this page object is aware of the logged in contact, and it's called _ contact ID. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting up a parameters array. This is to pass to my API, and that's just saying it's API version 3, and the only thing I want to pass to it is this contact ID. And then I'm going to call the API for UF match. UF match is user framework match. It's what's used to connect the CiviCRM contact with the framework, Drupal, Joomla, WordPress, that user ID. So I'm saying get that user, and I just need to get a single record, so I'm using getSingle as the action. And I'll go through this again later. And that returns, I'm assigning it to the user variable, and then the user ID is just one of the elements of that array. So this is how I call the CiviCRM API. Basically, it's really simple. It's a great, the version 3 of it is very consistent, very easy to use. You basically have your object, your action, and your parameters. And your parameters are going to have the elements that you're searching on, that you're retrieving. Your actions can be things like getSingle, update, create, delete. Pretty basic. I'll show you the list in a minute. The list of objects is quite extensive. So I really have a lot of access to different things in the system that I can get through the API. What it ends up being is it ends up being a wrapper to all those BAO functions. I mentioned the BAO that does all the business work. It's really just a wrapper to a lot of those, and it makes it a nice, consistent interface for retrieving it. So I use my API to get my user. I get my user ID. And now I have my user ID. Now I want to retrieve from my Red Shop orders table all the orders for that user ID. Now I should do this a little bit better. I manually hard-coded my prefix. I should have done that with the Joomla methods, but I was lazy. So I just did a straight SQL call, and then I ran execute query, which is just a function within Civi that lets you execute a query and retrieve an object. So I do that, which gives me all of the orders for this user. I'm going to cycle through it with a while loop, so fetched from that DAO object, and I'm just going to create my own little array. So the array is order list. I want each order to have the first element of the array to be the order ID, and then I want to grab the order ID, the order number, the order total, the order payment status, and the creation date. I grabbed the order ID and order number because I don't know what the difference is in Red Shop. I'm sure there's a distinction. They were all the same in all the records I looked at, but I just had a few sample records, so I'm not sure what they do, but that's all right. So I grabbed them all, built my array. It's going to cycle through them for this contact, and then I'm going to assign it to the page. So this is important. What this does is it passes the data to the template. The assigned will pass to a template or to a form. So, recap what I did. I have my contact, found out their user ID, got all their orders, cycled through it and built a nice little tidy array, and then I said, let's take that array and just give it to the template. Okay? With me? All right. Now, I've got one other hook that I'm implementing here, which is kind of cool, and that's my config hook. What config does is it allows me through a hook to impact the configuration of Civi. Very powerful. And what I'm using it for, oops, it's really large. This is a little bit more advanced. I'll just explain what I'm doing. We have custom PHP and template override directories. I want to create my own custom template, that's what you call a custom template directory just for this file. So what I do is, this is a little bit of stuff I have to do here for Joomla just to make sure I impact it in the right way. But I'm actually going to create a separate directory for PHP and a separate directory for the template within this plugin. So now over here in my plugin, I've got PHP TPL, and I'm going to put my, because now that I have this chunk of Red Shop orders, I have to display it, I have to render it in the template. I'm going to do it in my very own separate override directory. I didn't have to do that. I could have put it in my main override directory, but I thought it'd be kind of cool to isolate everything in this one plugin. Because then I could actually, this could be useful. I could throw this on the extension directory for Joomla, and people who use Red Shop and Joomla can add this to their dashboard. And it's all isolated. It's all self-contained in this plugin. And the way I do it is I just say, well, let me get the existing template directory, and let me append to it a second override directory. That's all it does. It says, okay, here's the current directory. Go into there, into the TPL subdirectory, and append it. Just add it to the array, the existing array of template. directories. So that's kind of a cool little advanced feature that I saw. I can't take full credit for it. I saw a friend of mine using it. I was like, oh, that's really handy. I got to use that too. All right, so everything's self-contained. I've got my work. I've got my template. Let me show you what I did here. I did it with an extra file. Okay, I didn't need to impact the entire file. So I have a little table here. I'll zoom in. Okay, so I built my little table, and I made it display none initially because I want to inject it into my DOM with jQuery and then display it. You know, a little header row here. Go through. I've got 4 columns here. I'm going to go through. I'm going to use a for each in Smarty and go through my order list. This is the array that I constructed and passed to Smarty. And here are my table cells. And then down here, really simple jQuery. Go grab this and put it at the top of my dashboard elements. Okay? So just assign it to a variable, prepend it that will inject it inside the element, and put it right at the top, and then display it. All right?
Do all the Smarty overrides basically use that same approach? Hide it, and then...
No, because all the Smarty templates, they're just going to render it. They're just going to have all that HTML. But I want to use the extra file so I don't have to override the entire file.
Okay, so all the extra overrides take this approach.
Something along those lines, yes. Yeah, I mean, basically, because what it literally is doing is it's just taking this extra file and it's sticking it at the very end of the existing file. So, you know, you want this chunk of HTML to be inserted at some point in that form, in that page.
Right.
So you have to use jQuery DOM manipulation to basically inject it into that location.
Thanks.
All right, so now let me go up to my plugins, and here's my plugin already, and I had it disabled, so I'm just going to go ahead and enable it. My local host is also stuck. And come back over here to my dashboard. All right. Remember, I uncommented that debug line here. So this is what happens when I have my debug enabled. So this is a CRM core error debug method, and it just spits out that page object. And you can see here I have contact ID. That's how I knew what my contact ID was. And I had the name of the page, which is what I conditioned on. So I spat that out initially, and then I built my condition on it. And if I come down a little lower, here's my product purchases. So John Doe has 2 orders, order 1 and 2. A lot of data here. A couple order, you know, here's the total amount that he has. There's the status of it. I grab the status and the date. All right. So that's plugins. All right. I guess we already talked about hooks, so I'll just skip this slide. This just gives you, some of the highlights for things that you can do with hooks. And okay, so here's our plugin example. So a little bit behind here. All right. And you saw an example of API version 3. I'm not going to go through it, extensively. I'm just going to kind of point you to resources, and you can explore it there. So there's a couple wiki docs that you can, here's a wiki doc that you can go, and that gives you a lot of good information about the API, how to reference it. There's a whole page with examples. We use PHP unit testing, so there's tons of examples that I typically will borrow from regularly when I'm trying to construct API. And there's also something called an API Explorer, and the demo site, I have a link to the Drupal one, but the Joomla has it as well. You can look at that Explorer there. And the Explorer is kind of cool because you can choose which objects you want to interact with in the action, and it will give you some examples. So you actually kind of construct it there and then copy it into your code. The API can be bound to PHP, which is what we did, but it can also be accessed with AJAX, REST, or Smarty. So you can actually reference the API at the Smarty layer. Now, it's recommended that you not do that too much because you kind of want to separate your presentation layer from your business layer, but you can do it. It's very possible to do that. pull it in through Ajax or directly in a Smarty call. And then REST is helpful for when you're doing it remotely. So if I want to have, for example, two websites talk to each other via the API, I can do that with the RESTful interface. So a lot of cool things there. The actions that you have available: create, delete, get count, get single, get fields, get value, replace, update. Okay. The distinction between the get will get everything, and that array that you saw earlier is basically what you'd see with a get. Oh, did I actually have it? I'll show it to you, and then in another slide I have the output of the API for an example. Get count is how many records are being returned. Get single is going to return a single record. Now you just have to be careful with that one, because if the parameters you're passing to the array, to the API call, will return more than one, then it's going to throw an error. So if you are getting like a single contact and you're passing an ID, you're safe, you're fine. And the advantage of it is it gives you a simplified array. It's like one level higher up, so it's just a little bit easier to work with. Get fields, that's handy if you want to find out all the fields in an option list or a custom field group or something like that. Get value is basically returning a single value. That requires you include return in your parameters. So I could do, for example, well, in that example that that's a bad example. So let's say that I wanted to get the contact's display name, and I knew the contact's ID. So I could do a params array and say ID equals 5, or passing a variable, whatever, and then return equals display name. And then if I do get value, all it will spit back to me is the display name. So it's basically doing a single item query. Replace, update, self-explainable. The Ajax is chainable. And actually PHP to some degree is chainable too. So you can actually do multiple API calls within API calls. So like maybe you wanted to do an individual, you wanted to return the contact object with a phone number of 518-1234567. Okay, so you could actually construct your parameters and call an API within it, and it would give you a chained result. So I've only fiddled with that a little bit. Here's the standard format. You do need to pass it the version number. I think at some point, probably pretty soon, they'll make that not necessary, because in version 4.3, the version 2 API will be completely deprecated. It won't even ship. So I don't think you'll need that soon. But right now, you can still reference older APIs, so that needs to be referenced. So in this one, I'm saying, give me everyone with the last name Doe who is an individual. That's kind of duplicative, because only individuals have last names. But that's right for the sake of example. So I just pass the value here, and then, or the field and the value. And then I do my CiviCRM API contact get params. Pretty straightforward. And it returns a big array like this. Okay? So under values, you'll have ID, and you'll have this. Now this particular example you can't see because it runs off the page, but I had two contacts in my database with the last name Doe. I had Jane Doe and John Doe. So there's actually, if you saw it down, there's actually a second array of ID, whatever, below this. And that's where get single would not work, because I'm not returning a single contact, I'm returning multiple ones. Is error it's always present when you're doing get, but if you're doing, well, you can always condition on, you can always do is error set and 1 to find out if you had a problem with the API. That's pretty consistent. Yeah, okay, so here the count. You can grab the count there too and see that there were 2 contacts returned. So this returns the entire contact object. And if you went to the database, you'd see all these fields. It's pretty straightforward what it does. It does a few conversions. You don't see it, but when it gets down to, actually the contact object returns an address and phone and email for the contact. Even though those are separate tables, they're included for the sake of facilitating access to data. And there are a few other conversions that it does. For example, in the address record, Civi stores an ID number for the state and province, but it will convert it so it gives you the actual name. I'm getting the... All right. Well, we got through most of it. Let me just talk about CiviCRM extensions. and then answer any questions. What time is it? 4 o'clock? All right, so extensions are CMS agnostic. There is an online directory. It's kind of new, so it doesn't have a whole lot in it right now, but it does exist, and I'm sure it will grow. So there's an online directory. You can install it through system settings, manage extensions. And I'll show you what that looks like right here. Whoops, that's manage events, not extensions. Administer system settings, manage extensions.
Don't forget to do surveys about the story and leave your surveys on the front desk.
All right, so here is CiviCRM extensions. There's a handful of ones that are being maintained by the core team right now, so they'll show up because they can be installed remotely. So they'll show up, and if you go ahead and click install, it will grab it from that remote site and install it directly on your site without you having to do any kind of transfer, download, browse, whatever. But if you are doing it locally, then obviously you're going to develop it locally. And that's what I did. I created one called Birthday Search, and you can see it says, oh, it's already installed. It would say local there. It would, yeah, where this says available, it would say local only. But I already installed it. I just disabled it. So I created an extension that creates a custom search to search birthdays. So the contact record can have a birthday on it, and I've run into a couple of different organizations that they want to send out birthday cards, or they want to send to a certain age group, and that sort of thing. And the advanced search will let you do date ranges for the birthday. But if you want, that's not always the flexibility that they want, especially if you're doing birthday cards. Like the New York State Senate uses CiviCRM, and a lot of the legislators like to send birthday cards every month to their constituents. This is your tax dollars at work. So they go and they want to say, give me everyone with a birthday in September. And you can't do that with a simple date range. So anyway, there's a lot of value in doing a search like this. So that's where you would install it. And you can do payment processors, custom searches, custom reports, and then these modules. We already talked about that. I did this one as a module. I was having some problems with the custom search type of extension, and I must have just missed something. I was doing it earlier today, so it might have just been me rushing and missing something. So I ended up doing it as a module, which takes a little bit more work. There's a little bit more involved in it, but I got it going, so I didn't worry about it. It's similar to a Joomla extension. There's an XML file. There's a bunch of folders that you need to have. There's some documentation online that can walk you through it. There's lots of great examples. You can create PHP and TPL files that you insert in that extension. You can create your own classes in that extension so that you can have something that doesn't even have to really fit into some existing object in core. It can be your own little Civi subcomponent if you wanted to. And then you go ahead and enable it and run it and test it. Here's links. Again, I'll make these PowerPoints available to all of the different tools. One thing I'll point out here, there's a tool called CiviX that was created by one of the core team developers, and it is an extension. It's like a extension quick start. So it's I think it's command line, and I have not actually used it, but because it's pretty new. But it just helps you kind of get started with your own extension, right? And it creates various helper functions that are useful, sets up your folder structure, names the files for you. It's similar to, there's lots of tools like that for Joomla, for components and plugins and stuff like that. This one is developed for these Civi extensions. So here's our sample one, the birthday search, and it will provide some advanced tools. So I'm not going to go through the code with you, but I'll just go ahead and enable it, and we'll take a look at it. Here's my custom search page. This lists all the custom searches that are available. You'll notice that birthday search is not there, but I just enabled that extension, so when I click refresh, it should show up. Uh-oh, it didn't show up. Oh, I have a, do you want to enable this? I forgot that. So make sure you're doing what you want to do. Even local-host is, I can't seem to get any, WAMP server on Windows to be fast. It's just frustrating. All right, here we go. Showed up, birthday search. Down at the bottom, a new search available to me. I'll click it. And, oops. So this lets me still search by date range specifically. I can search by age if I don't want to mess with calculating dates. I can do it by the birth month, by just the years, by just the date. So if I want everyone who was born the 1st through the 14th of the month, I could do that. So just, there's nothing too fancy about it. It just is a bunch of queries to allow that to happen. If I come over here, I'll show you where that resides. That's some of my plugins. Let me go to my media folder. You recall I put my extensions in CiviCRM custom extension. And then here is my birthday search. And there's all kinds of naming conventions you're supposed to stick to. If you use CiviX, I used another extension that had used CiviX. Then there's a separate file that has the helper functions that are created. But this is the one that has the heart and soul oh no, actually it doesn't. My heart and soul is in here. And these are all the various conditions for how I construct my SQL for this search. Here's the base SQL, and then how do I construct my from element, and then it glues it all together. I mean, I won't go through it, but basically it just chops up a glorified SQL statement with various options. And custom searches is a built-in tool in Civi, so there are certain methods that you can inherit from and extend to decide how I want it to be displayed, what template I want to use, all that kind of stuff. But really, what I want you to see is that you can create these extensions that are standalone, cross-platform, easy to install, make them available to other people. I'm probably going to make this one available because I've been meaning to do it for a while, and I just use this as an excuse to actually get it done, which was great. That's it. Some more resources up here. There is some online books, and including a developer guide. It's not the longest thing in the world, it's the most in-depth thing in the world. In fact, in a lot of ways, it follows a lot of what we covered here. There's a few other things I went into, a few things I didn't, but that's a really helpful guide. And there's a good group of guys that try to stay on top of making sure that's updated. I did notice a few things that are a little bit outdated, but for the most part, the community is pretty good about doing that. Actually, there's a book sprint going on right now. CiviCon Europe is going on in London, and they're doing some updates to a lot of these guides. So we try to do that on a regular basis within the community. And online documentation as well. Community, I mentioned before, there's some great resources. For developers, I'd recommend the forums. There is a developer forum that you can ask questions in. The core team is very good about tracking that. IRC, there's always good communication happening on the IRC channel. And the blogs. The blogs range in topics to here's a case study, to here's a new feature, to soliciting input from the community, to some developer tips. So it really runs the gamut. I just grab the RSS feed from the blog and track it on a regular basis. So if you're going to be a Civi developer, it's a great way to do it. Issue tracker here, issues.civicrm.org. That's where you can see all the things that are going to go in or the bugs. Track them, get patches if you need an immediate fix. It's a great community. I'm biased. I've been part of it for a while, and have grown to know a lot of people there. But it is a very welcoming and supportive community of developers. And that's it. All right, we went a little bit over. Any questions?
Actually, I have a question. As far as books for adjusting ACL inside of CiviCRM, are those all on that wiki page? Like
Yes.
list?
There's two. There's one that impacts permissions and one that impacts groups, I believe. So yes, they are on that wiki page.
Okay, cool.